In this lesson, we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, the causes of it here in the United States, why we entered into the Vietnam War, the effects both internationally and domestically here within the United States, and of course the lasting legacy that it had. So we talked just briefly about this before when we talked about the Cold War. So some of this background we did discuss before, but basically, you know, Vietnam itself has really its roots in colonialism, in Cold War politics. And just to note, very important to note, is that Vietnam was part of the Indo-Chinese peninsula that was under French control in the 1800s, okay, which was like modern-day Laos, Cambodia. That's Indochina. And in 1912, Ho Chi Minh, who's pictured down here to the right, he leaves and he has to flee from Vietnam because he was speaking out against, you know, the French colonizers. And when he flees, that's about the same time as the Russian Revolution occurs in 1917, and so he embraces the ideology of communism. So when he goes back to Vietnam in 1945, post-World War II, and launches the push to get the French out, America actually sides with the colonizers, with the French, because they're so fearful of communism. And their idea, what they were fearful of, was this idea of the domino theory that was out there. And this idea is really illustrated very well. Oh, I'm covering it there. Here, you know, Vietnam would fall, then Laos, Cambodia, then Thailand, then India, then Burma, and all of South Asia would fall to communism. That was their major fear in it. And just to give you an idea and a perspective, here is Vietnam, this little strip right here. This is the Indo-Chinese area. This is Indochina, I'm sorry. This is the Indochina area during this time period, and Laos and Cambodia were also part of it, just so you can get a visual of that. But again, in 1954, the Vietnamese people are successful in ousting out the French, even though they had America help economically. We supplied a lot of money. I think 4/5 of the money came from the United States. But what they decide to do with the Geneva Convention is to do what they did with the Korean Peninsula, which is to cut it in half. So there's a northern Vietnam, which would be a communist, and a southern, which would be not communist, would be free. And pretty much right away, it's not working in South Vietnam at all, because of the fact that the person that was in South Vietnam, and North Vietnam is where Ho Chi Minh was, and the communist, is because the person that was in power, a guy named Diem, was extremely corrupt. And so the United States, remember at this time, was more interested in keeping somebody in power who was anti-communist than they were about somebody that was anti-democratic. And so this comes back to really bite them, because this easily plants this ideology that, you know, they need communism there because it was so incredibly unstable and corrupt. And the Viet Cong begin to emerge in southern Vietnam, which is the sympathizers of the northern Vietnamese communist group. So when Kennedy becomes president, he takes a much more aggressive approach than Eisenhower did to Vietnam. So when Eisenhower became president, he just gave money to the area, but he never committed troops. But Kennedy actually commits troops. He's the first president to commit troops, 15,000 troops. He also orchestrates the removal of Diem. And so this was important, he thought, because obviously he was running it into the ground, and he felt that it was really working against him because the man was so incredibly corrupt. So he orchestrates the removal of Diem, and Diem is overthrown on November 1st. He's assassinated on the next day. Was he assassinated by the Viet Cong? Or was America, CIA involved? Who knows, okay? But he definitely was, assassinated. Interestingly, Kennedy is assassinated 3 weeks after Diem's removal and assassination, just when things were really heating up in Vietnam. And so that means that LBJ becomes president at this time. So Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president, and he is all in. He fully commits to Vietnam itself. And after an event on August of 1964 known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which torpedoes shot at the USS Maddox, LBJ uses that as his way to go completely all into Vietnam. And he orders an airstrike, a massive airstrike on Vietnam. And please pause the video here and watch the clip that's on the module about the Gulf of Tonkin, because this will give you a lot of perspective into what I'm talking about here in the next couple of slides. Okay, so hopefully you watched that clip and so you understand, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But basically what this does is it does give LBJ, authorization really to use more troops and gives him a reason to do that. And Congress quickly passes a resolution to essentially give him a blank check to do whatever he wanted, which becomes sort of really dangerous, right? It basically authorized the president to take any necessary military actions. It gives him tremendous war powers. And this event, giving, LBJ or the presidency for that matter, that much power in a war was because Congress is the only one that is supposed to declare war according to the Constitution, becomes very controversial. Okay, but LBJ does shift this into high gear, and just to note, the U.S. bombed North and South Vietnam with more bombs than was used by all sides during World War II, just to have that in perspective. They also start to begin the use of Agent Orange and also napalm. And so if you don't know what those are, Agent Orange is almost like a pesticide. It's a chemical that would destroy the forest, because one of the issues with Vietnam was that it was very difficult for soldiers to see. It was the topography of it was incredibly, the forests were thick and hard to see, and so they wanted to destroy the forest. So they used Agent Orange. Unfortunately, it's a pesticide, and not only did it, was harmful to the plants, it was also harmful to humans. This is going to come back to bite the United States because our Vietnam vets suffered quite a bit from this, a lot of them getting cancer from Agent Orange. The other thing that was used was napalm. So if you don't know what napalm is, it's like a sticky gas. It was something they would drop on the forest to light it on fire, to basically deforest the area. Unfortunately, napalm stuck to people too, and so there was many very horrid pictures of villagers that were struck by napalm from the planes and burned to death because of this. Okay, so LBJ actually, this was a very unpopular war. It was almost from the beginning, and it grows and grows and has become more and more unpopular. And LBJ, even though he could have run, because he took over the presidency after, Kennedy was assassinated, but he could technically have run another term, he decided not to run again. Okay, so he steps down, and mainly because of what happened with Vietnam. So last week we talked about his civil rights records and everything that he does. This, Vietnam itself is really, LBJ's political downfall. So Nixon, when he runs in 1968, now you might remember that Nixon ran against Kennedy in 1960 and lost. He was actually Eisenhower's vice president and was a favor to win. So he definitely takes a different approach this time to win this presidency. But one of the things that Nixon says that he has a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam. Okay, and he doesn't unveil what this is until after he becomes president. But this was very popular because, like I said, Vietnam was a very unpopular war. People did not want other people to, didn't see a reason for the United States to really be involved in that. So when Nixon at first attempts to negotiate with the Vietnamese, with Viet Cong, and it doesn't go well, and he has to figure out a way to leave Vietnam with peace with honor. And so he unveils a plan called Vietnamization. It was a gradual pullout of U.S. troops. The South Vietnamese, he felt that they could handle their burden of war, and we could just supply them weapons and things like that. And so he tells the American public he's going to do this. So everybody's all in, they're all for it. They're going to pull out of Vietnam. Okay. However, Nixon, behind closed doors, really didn't do this. He secretly bombed Cambodia to stop any more communist aggression. Now, this doesn't come out until like 3 years later that he did this, but this is going to add to the distaste for Nixon that's going to come about with Watergate because he was lying. And honestly, so was LBJ with the number of troops and everything that were committed to Vietnam, and a lot of other things that come out in the Pentagon Papers a little bit later on. There's a great movie called The Post that actually goes through this entire thing, and it really explains it. Okay, but the United States itself, it does withdraw from Vietnam. By 1971, 2/3 of Americans wanted out of the war. So we do withdraw. The Paris Peace Accords are drawn up. There was a POW exchange, and the United States recognized the Viet Cong as a legitimate political party. So it was supposed to be an armistice, okay, with this Paris Peace Accords between both North and South Vietnam. But this is not actually what happens, okay? The firing in the war quickly picks up immediately after the Paris Peace Accords. And Northern Vietnam takes over Southern Vietnam to become one communist country in April of 1975 with the fall of Saigon. So all of Vietnam after that becomes communist. So what were the kind of effects of the Vietnam War? Well, 58,000 troops died, 300,000 were wounded. The Vietnamese death toll is 2 million. And the domino theory only partially happens. Cambodia and Laos become communist, but not India, not Thailand, not the other countries that they suspected would become communist. But when the vets returned home, this was really what was significant. It was such an unpopular war. In just a minute, we're going to talk about the anti-war protests and things of that nature. But sadly, the Vietnam vets that came home, a lot of them were blamed for going to war. But you have to understand, this was not a war of people that were enlisting to go, like World War II, like we were bombed in Pearl Harbor, and it was a very popular war in the United States. Vietnam was unpopular. They had to draft people to go, and if you evaded the draft, you could up to 10 years in prison. It was a crime. And so the people that came home, some of the Vietnam protesters actually called them baby killers. They were spat on. So it takes like 10 years for people to really recognize the sacrifice that these Vietnam vets really made, and to give them their memorial that stands in Washington, D.C. today. And just side note, Roy Benavides here, very well decorated, recognized Mexican American from Texas during the Vietnam War. Okay, so what kind of effect did it have politically on the United States? Well, one of the biggest things is that the Congress is like, whoa, we never want to give the presidency that kind of power ever again. And so they initiate something called the War Powers Act that was created in 1973 that essentially reversed the Gulf of Tonkin, so that blank check was ripped up, and basically reduced the president's war-making power. It requires the president essentially to give 48 hours in advance notice before committing any troops. $738 billion was spent on this, and sit down for this. Another $270 billion are still paid each year to Vietnam vets for benefits between, PTSD, Agent Orange, and all that, to the tune of like $1 trillion when you add all of that in. Okay, so crazy amount of money that was spent on Vietnam itself. Okay, so the anti-war protest really begins in the late 1960s. Martin Luther King was a huge anti-war person, mainly because of the fact that African Americans were disproportionately drafted at a much higher rate, like I want to say 50 times higher than white men. And so he was against this because white men tend to find a way out of the draft, where black men ended up being a lot of much higher percentage of the people that were serving in the war. For instance, I think it was like 11% of African American males made up the population, but they represented over 20 to 25% of the Vietnam soldiers. And so obviously that's a disproportionate number of people there. But we also see the student movement really pick up. And this really happens after the Cambodia bombing is really is released, the fact that the Cambodia bombing happened, but really the Tet Offensive in 1968 when America loses big and it becomes obvious that it's going to be a really long war. And so college students formed something known as the Students for the Democratic Society. They were major organization that was against Vietnam protests. And like I say, that really 1865, late 1960s, or 1965, I'm sorry, and really into the 1970s is when all these major protests really happen. And there's also major, burning of their draft cards. Those that decided that they would rather go to jail than serve in the Vietnam War, they would literally have a protest by burning their draft card, refusing to go. And I think I have a picture of it here, some pictures of some draft burning that happened after the war itself. Okay, and the last thing I'll talk is the counterculture movement that occurs. And this really comes about with the anti-war protest. This happens really hand in hand. And this was a complete rejection of the values that, disjunct between the older generation, the younger generation. They practiced free love and free sex and drugs, experimentation, and all things like this. And so, one of their biggest quotes was "Make love, not war," which really epitomized what the counterculture movement was really about. And of course, the big event of the counterculture movement was Woodstock, where they had 400,000 people attending the Slide Music Festival. And that was the people that got in. There were people that were lined up that never really get in. And, the Woodstock really epitomizes the counterculture movement and what it really meant. So that's why so many historians look at Woodstock to describe, the counterculture movement. But anyway, that is basically it. That's what we're going to learn about related to Vietnam War. Now, some of you might actually have relatives that served in the Vietnam War, so I encourage you to hear their stories if they're willing to talk. But like I said, Vietnam was not a popular war, and we still have vets today that are around that fought in the Vietnam War, but not many are really willing to talk about how horrific it really was. Have a great day.